Hello and welcome to our next module. In this module, I probably shouldn't say this, but don't worry about taking notes. But this is really meant to be a lighter lifting module for review. What I really want to do is give you a nickel tour of all of the amendments. Have a couple of stories to throw in there for you, give some context. And so with that, let's go and get started. Uh, as you know, the first 10 amendments, Bill of Rights, they were all ratified in 1791. As we discussed in a previous module, really the Constitution in large part was ratified based on the promise of the Bill of Rights. All the colonies, new states had a tradition of the Bill of Rights. That's what they were used to. That's what they wanted. We had talked about that in the module around the Anti-Federalist. So with that, let's just go through here. Again, lighter lifting, just want to give you some familiarity with them. First Amendment, you know this, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion, prohibiting free exercise thereof, freedom of speech, press, peaceful assembly. Now, one thing about this, I'll just throw this out there right now. What you find in the course of our history, whether it's this or other individual rights, you always have this balance. I mean, no right is absolute. Freedom of speech is not an absolute right. There are some areas and some circumstances where it does not apply in the case of national security and things like that. But again, the First Amendment, speech, religion, press, and peaceful assembly. Second Amendment, we discussed this in the previous module, the right to bear arms. Third Amendment, we touched on this as well in a previous module. Quartering of soldiers. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Right? The Fourth Amendment. This has to do with illegal search and seizure. It's the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, one comment on this, though. What is an unreasonable search and seizure? And that's where over the time, through cases like U.S. versus Ross, Matt versus Ohio, the Supreme Court has helped define this. For example, if I've got a search warrant for stolen tires, I can't be rifling through someone's jewelry box. Another thing that we found as the courts have defined it, there are different thresholds. If something needs to be searched in a home, that may require a search warrant. However, if it involves a car, you may not need a search warrant because by the very nature of a car being mobile, by the time you get the search warrant, the car's long gone, and whatever evidence might be secured is long gone as well. All right. Fifth Amendment, plead the fifth, right? Rules. This has to do with rules for grand jury indictment, due process, and prohibits self-incrimination and double jeopardy. The Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. So this does establish trial by jury. And I do know, I do get some folks that roll their eyes when they see speedy and public trial. But again, a lot of that has to do with the balance of the individual's rights and the ability to receive due process of law. All right. Seventh Amendment. In suits of common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined by any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Again, we see here trial by jury. Eighth Amendment. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Again, what is cruel and unusual, right? We do understand the concept here, we understand the intent, but again, in our history, we continue to define what is cruel and unusual. All right. The Ninth Amendment. I find this very interesting, and for a lot of folks, upon reading this, it's a head scratcher. Let me explain this to you here in just a second. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed or denied or disparaged others retained by the people. Do you remember in a previous module we talked about how the Federalists, when they crafted the Constitution, they originally did not have a Bill of Rights because they were concerned if they left something off the list, they may take away rights intentionally from everyone. That's what this amendment addresses. This is kind of saying, hey, if we left something out here, and I know I'm overly simplifying this, but really, if there's something that's left out of the Constitution that we deem protected individual rights, well, they're still protected just because they're not listed here in the document. All right. The 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So remember, we've talked before that originally you had this concept of dual sovereignty, that under the Articles of Confederation the states had full sovereignty, but with the Constitution they wanted to pull away certain things to a national government so things could run a little bit more smoothly. For example, interstate commerce. So what this is really saying is that, okay, if there are not certain rights and authorities granted to the national government or denied to the states, then everything else is left to the states, right? If you're wondering, well, what is prohibited to it by the states? Well, part of the Constitution does prohibit states from entering into foreign relations. So the state of North Carolina cannot enter into foreign relations with, say, Germany. That is reserved for the national government. Okay. Now we go on to 1795. This is the 11th Amendment. Was ratified in 1795. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. This was one of those, I don't have the proposed date on here, but this one went through pretty quickly. Here's what happened. You had some citizens from one state who were owed monies from Revolutionary War appropriations by another state, right? And they never got paid. And so they were going to sue this other state in federal court to get their money. This kind of scared everybody a little bit. They didn't want to have it where, say, citizens of Pennsylvania could sue South Carolina, citizens of Georgia could sue Delaware. That they didn't want any part of that. So they kind of got this one together pretty quickly and put the kibosh on it. So in this case, today, I can't sue the state of Maryland. All right, don't have standing. So this was really in response to something that was about ready to happen that they want to go ahead and prevent from happening. All right, we move on to the next amendment, 1804. What happened is that up to this amendment, the runner-up in the presidential election became vice president. So, you might have a vice president who couldn't stand the president, vice versa. And what we also had seen in the election of 1800 was that Aaron Burr almost became president. Now, I'm just giving you the quick and dirty on this one. But basically, what could have happened is I could run for vice president, but if I got enough votes, I could become president as a result. So what this did is it established really what we know as the ticket system, where we have the president and vice president running together. You run for one or the other. You can't just have this system where, okay, number one becomes president, number two becomes vice president. Oh, you're running for vice president? Oh, you could be president if you get enough votes. All right. So those kinds of things. It just really was one of those administrative things that was being cleaned up. All right. Now we jump all the way from 1804 to 1865. The abolition of slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Okay. Then we move on to 1868, the 14th Amendment, and this is really an oversimplification. But really, the 14th Amendment was attempting to protect the rights of newly freed slaves, right? And so we have the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment, What we find here as a quick story is that early on, right after the Civil War, African Americans made strong gains in society. Uh, the, you know, you had members of Congress who were African American, and what happened? Well, the 14th Amendment was helping to protect that. Well, some court cases started building up to the Supreme Court. And historically, we look back on the Supreme Court, they whiffed on this one because instead of really uh, applying what the 14th Amendment was intended to do, they said, oh, well, this really only applies to the federal government. It doesn't necessarily apply to the states. And it really postponed a lot of the gains in civil rights for African Americans for decades as a result. So it really wasn't one of the better chapters for the Supreme Court. But again, that's just a quick story around that. 15th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, we have to remember this. At this point in time, women could still not vote. But this amendment was attempting to protect the voting rights of African American men post-Civil War. All right? 16th Amendment. We jump all the way to 1913. This is one we really think of every April when it comes tax time. But the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So the 16th Amendment gives the federal government the authority to levy income taxes. A little bit of story behind this one. About 15 years prior, give or take, the federal government had been levying income taxes, and it bubbled up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court struck it down, saying no, the Constitution does not give the federal government authority to levy income taxes. Well, this is an example right here where an amendment overrode a Supreme Court ruling. Okay? Same year. 17th Amendment. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Now, when it comes to this, we don't even think about this much anymore. A lot of times, unless you're taking a class like this, you don't even realize this. But that up until this point, it was the state legislatures that appointed the U.S. senators. It was not us through popular election. I will tell you, there are a lot of political scientists, a lot of scholars that say ever since this amendment has been passed, we haven't had quite the level of statesmen in the U.S. Senate as we saw prior to. Okay? Then we go from 1913 to 1919. Prohibition. Okay, so the 18th Amendment, prohibition of alcohol. All right. Next, 1920. The 19th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of sex. So this was women's suffrage. So here we are. If we think about it, we went all the way from the ratification of the Constitution to the early 1900s, 1920, before women had the ability to vote. There was one little exception to that, but we can get into that later. The 20th Amendment, this ratified in 1933. Now, this is a lengthy amendment, but we'll just kind of cut to the chase. This really kind of cleaned up some administrative things. I'll tell you, as was explained to me when I took this class some odd years ago, there was a story where this one individual, you had an outgoing president and then an incoming president, and there was a time lag of a few days. There was this one individual who actually was president, didn't even know it until after the fact. So what the 20th Amendment really did was just change the dates for terms ending from president, vice president, Congress to make sure that those calendars made walking around sense and provided for proper succession from one term to the next. All right. 21st Amendment. This was the repeal of prohibition, 1933. Okay, moving on. The 22nd Amendment. This is a very interesting one, and at the tail end of this module, I'll talk a little bit more about this, how this really changed and transformed the presidency. But This is the amendment that capped a president at serving 2 terms. Okay, one little piece of background to this: during the Constitutional Convention, for a big part of the time, they had discussed a single 7-year term for president. Then they backed away from it, and they came up with 4-year ad infinitum. Okay. Now, this amendment was really in response to the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt was first elected in 1932, was elected 32, 36, 40, 44, died in office in 45. Truman took over that term. But post-World War II, there was a very favorable Republican Congress. And yes, there was talk, well, hey, we haven't seen the White House in 20 years. We don't want this to happen again. I will tell you that arguably this amendment has hurt Republicans more since it was ratified than it has Democrats. But in this case, no one can serve more than 2 terms. Now, this isn't a consecutive terms. This is terms. So if someone was a 1-term president and came back 12 years later and got reelected, they can still only serve 1 term. All right? More on this in a few minutes. 23rd Amendment, 1961. What this does, you've got all the verbiage here, but basically prior to this amendment, if you live in Washington, D.C., you couldn't vote in a presidential election. So what this does is it gives Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes, as it really kind of as if it were a small state. All right. So anyway, you see the verbiage there. But again, this really just provides citizens of Washington, D.C. the authority or the ability to vote in a presidential election. All right. 24th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president, vice president, or for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state by reason of failure to pay poll tax or other tax. Poll taxes historically have been a mechanism to attempt to disenfranchise African American voters from being able to vote. Again, we see an amendment here to strike that down, make that practice unconstitutional. 25th Amendment. This is something that you hear about here and there, but this was ratified in 1967, and it really addresses a couple things. We'll hit this again later as well, but vice presidential succession and also presidential disability. A couple things about this. A few years after this amendment was ratified, the vice presidential succession kicked in. So you had Nixon, president, his first vice president resigned. And so prior to this amendment, we had times where a vice president, we didn't have one. We might have a vice president die in office. We just were without a vice president till the next election. In this case, a president can nominate to Congress a vice president to come into office. It's simple majority, both houses, to ratify. And that's where Gerald Ford became our first and only person to go through this process. And subsequently, when Nixon resigned, Ford became our first and only unelected president. Presidential disability. What this amendment does allow for is Congress has the ability to remove a president from office if they cannot perform the duties of the office and they refuse to step down. Now, I've said this for years around this concept. I personally don't necessarily think that this would ever come into play, the presidential disability, unless it was truly a bipartisan slam dunk. The one example in history that we can point to is actually Woodrow Wilson. This is a story not everybody's heard, but Woodrow Wilson, towards the end of his administration, had a massive stroke. And as the story goes, nobody could really communicate with him other than his wife. So his wife was actually directing the cabinet what to do, what not to do, policy and things like that. Had the 25th Amendment been in place at the time of the Wilson administration, there's a good likelihood Wilson would have been removed from office based on his condition post-stroke. All right. 26th Amendment. This, due to our involvement in Vietnam, the dialogue of, well, I'm old enough to die for my country, serve my country, but I can't vote. This lowered the voting age to 18 years of age. All right. And the last amendment that we have passed, this was ratified in 1992, I find this very interesting. No law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. Now, I didn't put this on any other slide, but I did in this case down to the bottom. This amendment was originally proposed in 1789. It took a long time, I'll let you do the math, before it became ratified. What this amendment really says is Congress cannot vote itself an immediate pay raise. All right, it just took that long to ratify this thing. So what happens now is if, say tomorrow, Congress votes itself a pay raise, it has to go through the next congressional election cycle before that raise can take effect. Okay? Now, as we finish up this module, I'm going to get back to something here for just a couple minutes. The 22nd Amendment, the amendment that caps a president at 2 terms. Now, let me just explain to you. You see here, I've just got a little graph here, a little visual for you to kind of follow. You might be thinking, hold it, whoa, a term is 4 years. Why are we talking 8? Well, first thing, since 1932, when Roosevelt was elected, no president who has run for re-election has lost re-election except for 2. That was Carter and Bush, back in '92. And in both cases, it was the economy. Other than that, when we look at the different administrations, Eisenhower would have won a 3rd term, but he served 2. We look at the Kennedy-Johnson administration really as one administration. You have 2 terms there. Reagan 2 terms, Bush 2 terms, Clinton 2 terms, Obama 2 terms. So you see where I come with this. So the general assumption among scholars is really based on our history from almost the last 100 years. Unless you have a dumpster fire of an economy, a president usually gets reelected. All right. Now, so why have I got this timeline here? Let's think about this for a second. Prior to this amendment, psychologically, I could run ad infinitum for president. All right. Prior to FDR, no one had served more than 2 terms. But just think about it for a second. There's a big difference between kind of knowing what's probably going to happen versus someone hard and cold saying this is not going to happen. All right. So on day 1, or even prior to day 1 of a presidential administration, I know the clock is ticking. I know 8 years is the max, period. Now, you've probably heard of a concept called coattails, right? So when a president is running for election and wins, typically there are more members of that president's party that win election in Congress than not. That's where the coattails come in. Now, when a president first gets elected, that first 2 years, you see I've got that 2 in green, that first 2 years, that is the president's most favorable time to get really legacy legislation passed, right? Just within the last 2 administrations, you had the Affordable Health Care Act that happened in the first 2 years of the Obama administration. We had the tax reform bill under Trump's administration the first 2 years. Neither one of those pieces of legislation would have happened year 2 to 4. Just wouldn't happen. All right. So when we get to that year 2 in the off-year election, what does happen? Typically, almost all the time, there's a pullback. So the president's not running for re-election, so the opposition party typically picks up additional seats in the House and Senate. So again, a president does not have quite as much support of Congress to get things done. All right. Now, when we get to year 4, what happens? So assuming a president gets reelected, a president will pick up some seats that were lost in that off-year election, but typically won't have as much support as that president had coming into office when the clock started ticking. But here's the other thing about it. Now the clock is really ticking. I don't have a full 8 years to work with. Starting to get a little bit more sense of urgency. But I will say this, though. The time's already passed for a president to really get something done. All right. That time was the first 2 years. So at this point, year 4 through 6, it's on to get anything done. Because what happens when it comes to year 6? There are two things that happen when it comes to year 6. President isn't up for re-election. First thing is year 6 through 8. That's what we call a lame duck president. All right, they're just really 1 foot out the door. But the second thing is, see how I have there year 6 in red? Here is what happens pretty much almost every time. And the scholars have written about it, stated we almost get tired of this person. Period. And the opposition party of the president makes hay in congressional elections. This is where you might see a Congress, one or both houses, flip to the opposition party. And this is where you get gridlock in many cases in the last 2 years of an administration. There is one exception. And what I'm just saying around that, we go all the way back to the 60s. If you view the Kennedy-Johnson administration as one administration, we saw that in the 66 election. The Republicans made some strong gains. And ever since then, we've seen this as a cycle. We saw it in the Reagan administration, that the 6th year of his administration. We saw it in the Bush administration, the 6th year. We saw it in the 6th year of the Obama administration. So we do have a regular cadence of history with that. Now, you might be thinking, hold it, Mitch, you skipped Clinton. Yes, I did. That's the one exception to this, and there are some lessons we can take away from this. What happened with Clinton about that time, if you remember, is that it was a partisan play, but Clinton was impeached. Now, he was not removed from office, but the House of Representatives did, simple majority, pass articles of impeachment of Clinton. There was a big political blowback from the electorate, from the voting population. They didn't like that partisan play. And so a lot of those losses that we would have expected from the Democrats in that election, we didn't see. And I find it very interesting, going into the 6th year of the Obama administration, Boehner, who was Speaker of the House at the time, he was actually going to sue President Obama for what he called presidential overreach. And I remember telling my students at the time, if I were a Democratic strategist, I would say, please, please, please sue the president in court. Because if anything, the Democrats had actually seen and had played that same card some odd years before, and it just backfired on them. Well, somebody got to Boehner, he dropped everything, and in that off-year election, the Republicans took control they had control of one of the House of Representatives, but then they took control of the Senate. So all that to say, when you look at this cycle, the amendment really produces a very aggressive president. It should, because we know that if for a president to get anything truly meaningful done, it has to be done within the first 2 years. Now, on the flip side of it, we don't usually see a president be able to get much, if anything, done in the last 2 years. And so, again, as I said before, prior to FDR, no one had served more than 2 terms. But again, it's one thing to know something as kind of a reality, but the other thing, when it's hard cast in stone, this is it. The psychology becomes different. Okay? So with that, I know this is a little bit longer of a module, but I want to give you a nickel tour of the amendments. And I especially wanted to discuss in particular this 22nd Amendment and how that really changed the approach of any president to an administration and forging policy. With that, as always, go back and review this as needed, and we will pick it up in the next module. Thank you.